Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Pieter Emmer. Hello, Professor Emmer. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
All right, great. So, Professor, we're going to be talking about the Dutch Empire. And I
Mhm.
must tell our guests that prior to starting this conversation, we had an excellent rapport, and we're going to be revisiting some of our earlier statements in that prior discussion. The Dutch Empire, Professor. How did the Dutch get rich?
Well, uh, they did, of course, make money out of their empire, and this was perhaps more important for the Dutch than for the French and for the English. You could compare it to Portugal, a small country in Europe, because the Dutch are really a small country with a huge empire, both in the West and in the East. Now, where there's a big difference between the Eastern Empire of the Dutch and the Western Empire resembles that of other European nations like the French and the English and the Spanish. It means that the Dutch had some plantation colonies in the West Indies, and actually they tried to conquer also part of South America. In fact, they conquered for, I think, 40 or 50 years, part of Portuguese Brazil in the northeast, around the town of Recife, where they actually started with plantation agriculture. But that became a drain on the finances of the Dutch West India Company because the Portuguese were much more stubborn than the Dutch expected, fought back, and in the end, I think in 1651, defeated the Dutch, so they had to retire from South America. A similar thing happened in North America, where the Dutch, in addition to the French and the English, had settlement colonies. The present state of New York, including parts of Pennsylvania, Connecticut, were actually Dutch in the first 3/4 of the 17th century. But again, the English, were stronger than the Dutch, and were able to defeat the Dutch. So they had to surrender that colony in North America. It was called New Netherlands, actually, to the English. So those two attempts failed, and especially the attempt to have a colony in South America, to hang on to that colony in Brazil, did bankrupt the West India Company. I mean, the production of sugar was always interrupted. There was very little sugar produced because the plantations were constantly being destroyed by troops, etc. So that was, I think, a financial disaster and also a human disaster because, of course, many soldiers in the employ of the Dutch died there in the wars against the Portuguese. But you could say that the Dutch in the West Indies were a middle-sized, perhaps even a small-sized plantation colonizer. They had 6 islands in the Caribbean, which weren't really suited for plantation agriculture, but were used as a sort of turning points, as sort of hubs for trade, with the surrounding area. The main plantation colonies were on the north side of the South African mainland, called Suriname, and what today is Guyana, used to be British Guyana. That originally was also Dutch, and they had several smaller colonies there. So that is the story of the Dutch in the West Indies. More interesting, and also financially, I think, is the Dutch Empire in the East, which was, I think, perhaps larger even than the British and that of the Portuguese in Asia. And they concentrated on Southeast Asia, let's say present-day Indonesia. But they also had trading forts on the coast of India, what used to be called British India, and they were the only trading company allowed to trade with the Japanese. They had a trading castle or a small trading place on the island of Deshima in the harbor of Nagasaki in Japan. So that trading empire was rather impressive. And furthermore, the products they brought from Asia to Europe were unique. Actually, no other colonizer was able to bring to Europe the same assortment of goods as the Dutch were able to do. Well, in the West, they produced the same products as the English and the French and the Portuguese, let's say sugar, tobacco, and coffee. So the East is more interesting because the Dutch had a virtually monopoly on certain products from Asia, and they made a lot of money there.
All right. Interesting analysis, Professor. And several pertinent points were revealed. One, it appears that the Dutch were able to exploit the gains of empire building, but as you said, some of the plantations were unsuitable for development. So would you also say that the empire was indeed expensive?
Yes, you should realize, of course, yes, it was expensive. And the idea was that the empire should finance itself, that not money from the mother country would go to military and administrative costs in the empire, but that these should be paid for by the colonies themselves. So if you look at the administrative structure of the West Indian colonies, you see that there were a very limited number of civil servants, that the armies that they had were very small and not very expensive because there was simply not the money to pay for them. And only on very special occasions did the Dutch mother country subsidize, or let's say, a military operation, and then only one at a time, and not, permanently. The plantations, of course, I think all of the plantations, perhaps with a few exceptions, all of the plantations were in private hands. So the benefits didn't flow directly to the Dutch state, but to the families and the investors who had invested in these plantations.
Exactly my point. So a distinguished academic has a paper looking at the profitability of imperialism, and it's really interesting, but as I've always said, imperialism creates wealth for a few, not the many. Rome,
absolutely
yes,
right. Yes, it was, you could say, a trick by some members of the elite to use a system for their personal advantage. It's absolutely right. And just to show an example that it could go wrong, many of the Dutch plantations in the very beginning were owned by wealthy merchants. Fine. Well, at some stage in the middle of the 18th century, the plantation sector started to expand. You see this in the British West Indies, you see this in the French West Indies, but also in the Dutch West Indies. So there was a need for larger investments because new plantations were capital intensive, especially sugar plantations. They needed a lot of equipment. And of course, you needed to invest in slaves, which were extremely expensive. So there was a need to have to get more money. And what the Dutch did, I think, was unique at the time. They floated plantation loans. In other words, everybody in the Netherlands, or even outside the Netherlands, if you're in Britain or in France, you could also participate, or in Germany, whatever. You could buy a share in a mortgage. And then if there was money, let's say you had a few 100,000 guilders, what's the currency at the time, then you sent the mortgage fund that had collected the investment money, sent an agent to the West Indies asking planters whether they wanted a mortgage or an extra mortgage. And of course, the majority said yes. So you will see that in around the middle of the 18th century, something like 60 million guilders went to the Dutch West Indies, and not only to the Dutch West Indies. These agents also sold mortgages in the Danish West Indies even in some of the British islands where, funded by plantations, loans were funded by the Dutch, and in the French West Indies. Now, all went well as long as the prices of coffee and sugar were rising. However, I think you know that in the middle of the 18th century, not only sugar became an important export product, but almost as important, perhaps sometimes even more important, was coffee. And that started in the French West Indies and later also in the Dutch West Indies. Now, everybody then was producing coffee, and what happened, the coffee price went down, and the planters didn't get as much income as they had calculated. And that meant that they were barely able to pay the interest on their loans, but were unable to repay the mortgage. And the majority of the planters in the Dutch West Indies who had these mortgages went bankrupt.
The article I mentioned earlier is titled "The Myth of Uneconomic Imperialism, the Portuguese in Angola, 1836 to 1926.
Yeah.
Yes, it's an old article, but still quite interesting. We're going to continue this discussion, but before we do so, there's another important question, Professor. The Dutch, before the slave trade and the plantation complex, were the Dutch en route to getting rich?
Well, rich is a big word, but of course they were making money by trade. I think that was important. And they were rather hesitant to conquer territories, because if you conquer territories, what is it? You need administrative civil servants, you need an army to defend it, you need investment to build houses, fortresses, etc., etc. So the Dutch, I think, before they, built their own empire, I think were able to gain money by trading to empire from other nations. They were very good in trading to the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire. It has been rumored that I think the majority of the sugar produced in Portuguese Brazil was not brought to Lisbon and to Europe by Portuguese ships, but by Dutch ships. And that, of course, was ideal. You didn't need to invest in a colony, you didn't need to defend it, others were paying the costs, and you only gained by trading.
Yes, I know that students of Dutch history are familiar with the Dutch Golden Age and the intellectual developments that occurred during that time. And I'm referring to that period of development because I'm quite serious about dispelling myths and informing people. And there's an argument that Europe got rich because of the plantation complex and the slave trade. So the Dutch Golden Age, would that have occurred without the slave trade and the plantation complex?
No. If you look at the slave trade, the Dutch were minor players in the slave trade. The three big nations in the slave trade, of course, were the Portuguese, then the British, and then the French. And then you had the smaller nations like the Danes, the Swedes, and the Dutch, which transported far fewer slaves than the. So if this applies, if you got rich from the slave trade, the country that should have been the wealthiest should have been Portugal, because it was the major slave trader at the time. Now, of course, Portugal wasn't the wealthiest nation in Europe at the time, so the link doesn't work. I mean, it's a false argument that the slave trade makes you rich. You could also be bankrupted, you could also lose money, and I think there's more, you need more than just the slave trade to profit. I think the majority of the profits in the 17th and 18th century were not from overseas empires, they were made within Europe itself.
Excellent. There's a new article by Professor David Eltis refuting that argument. Iberian dominance and the intrusion of the Northern Europeans into the Atlantic world. Slave trading as a result of economic growth. Over 50 pages, but worth every page.
Yes, I do agree. I think that's very important. I think he is one of the most outstanding scholars in the field. As you know, he deserves all our thanks for the fact that he cataloged all the ships in the Atlantic slave trade. That database slavevoyages.org is excellent. It's unique, and it did cost him a lot of time and effort. I think everybody should be very grateful to him having organized that. And in addition, his analytical work is excellent. I think if there were to be a Nobel Prize for an Atlantic scholar, for a historic scholar, I think he should have it.
I agree. I'm a fan. I would love to have him on the show at some point. Professor, we must also share the serious argument with our listeners. Prior to the interview, you were informing me that historically in Europe, economic growth was driven by internal factors and it did not require immense capital. Would you expound on that argument for us, please?
Yes, well, if you look at the early industries, well, first of all, of course, in the economic development of the 17th and let's say the first half of the 18th century, could not have been driven by industry because there was no industry. And if you say it is overseas trade, first of all, we should realize that most countries in Europe were trading with one another, not with areas outside of Europe. The trade to areas outside of Europe was relatively modest in comparison with the trade within Europe. That's something that people forget. Now, if you look at the link between non-European trade and economic development, then countries like Germany, Switzerland, Eastern Europe, should be poor because they did very little intercontinental trade. While Spain, Portugal, France, England, and Holland should be the wealthiest. And I think if you look at estimations of per capita income for the Netherlands, yes, this is true, but for other countries, it is less visible. So it is very difficult to make a case if you trade internationally, outside of Europe, automatically you become wealthy. I think that is too easy.
And also,
mm-hmm.
Also tell us about capital formation, because I remember you saying that in businesses did not require immense capital from outside. So comment on
if
that
you look
issue.
at the early industries, let's say you wanted to set up a textile mill. Those were the early industries in Scotland or in England or in Wales, whatever. Look at the money you needed. You needed you needed a mill. You needed a very primitive technology. And for the rest, there was very little capital needed. So the majority of the capital for the early industries in Britain was provided by local investors, not by people who had a link to the international markets.
All right. Now, Professor, I don't know if you recognized it, but earlier in the discussion, when you were explaining the development of the Dutch Empire, you referred to institutional development. So you were talking about trading relationships and financing and how plantations raise capital. And my thesis, I don't think that it is that interesting, but my argument is that the Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, the English East India Company, all of these businesses represented a business model that allowed Europeans to oversee the plantation complex. And this is why people can argue that the plantation complex was supposedly profitable, because it was driven by human capital and institutional innovations. The Dutch West India Company, why was it important?
Yeah, well, of course, the only successful company was the Dutch East India Company. As I explained, they were able to import goods from Asia that were unique, that couldn't be imported via other ways. And that meant that they could actually ask a price for these products that included a lot of the overhead, because the Dutch East India Company was the largest enterprise in the world at the time, with a tremendous number of personnel. And they didn't have to rationalize or compete Even in times of mishaps, when ships disappeared or didn't return, or cargo was lost, they could still make a profit because they could higher the price of the goods they were selling because there was no competition. If you look at the Dutch West India Company, the situation is completely different. It's still a limited company that is financed by shareholders. It's the same as the Dutch East India Company, its example. But if you look at the products they were able to bring from overseas to Europe, to the Netherlands, it is sugar, coffee, gold, and they traded in slaves. And all of these activities, were also executed by other nations. So there was nothing unique in what they produced. Now, in order to profit from the Atlantic trade, you needed to close your home market from the competition from foreigners. Then you could make a profit. If you made sugar and you sold it on the British market and you excluded sugar from other countries that produced cheaper, you still could make a profit because there was no competition. The Dutch never had a thought of free competition, and that meant that the Dutch West India Company went bankrupt because the overhead costs were far too high in relation to the smaller companies in Britain, in France, and later on, of course, also in the Netherlands. You should realize that the Dutch West India Company lost its monopoly gradually already in the 17th century, and in the 18th century, it was completely abolished, and the trade in the Atlantic was allowed for everybody who wanted to trade there. And the Dutch West India Company became, as one of the Dutch historians said, a body without a soul, because it didn't earn any money anymore.
Repeat what you just said. You said that the Dutch West India Company never thought of what? I didn't hear that part.
Sorry, the Dutch West India Company never introduced goods into the Netherlands or into Europe that were unique. They had to compete with the British traders. They had to compete with the French traders, and on the market, the European market for sugar and coffee and some other products, the Dutch did not discriminate. The majority of the sugar that was imported into the Netherlands in the 18th century was not from Dutch plantations.
All right. Professor, there's another point that you must expound on again for us. When you were talking about the plantation complex, you were mentioning how the institutions were facilitated to engage ordinary people. So tell us more about the stock market and why that was so important.
Well, the stock market was very well developed in Holland, and you could actually buy stocks in companies that drained the internal lakes in the Netherlands. As you know, we are a country surrounded by water. And in the 17th and 18th century, several of the large internal lakes in the Netherlands were drained and made into agricultural land. And you could buy stocks in the drainage of these lakes by building mills, by drains, etc., etc. You could also buy stocks in enterprises, but I think for the non-European trade, the stocks of the Dutch East India Company and later the Dutch West India Company were unique. They were sold on the Amsterdam stock market. You could inherit stocks from others. You could sell stocks, and I think that was very much developed. At the beginning of the Dutch East India Company, there was no dividend paid in interest on those stocks. If the Dutch East India Company made a profit, of course, the stockholders should actually get a share of that. But at the very beginning, that share was paid out in colonial products. So then the shareholders got bales of cinnamon, cloves, what have you, that they then could sell, of course. But it's only later that the shares provided that the Dutch East India Company provided money on a regular basis, and also they provided interests in time when they made a loss. That sounds very strange, but they didn't want to upset the market. So when they had a year in which they made a loss, they borrowed money in order to pay the stockholders. And of course, that's the wrong policy. And in the end, the company went bankrupt.
And the whole did institutions, again, like the stock market and the insurance and insurance aid the plantation complex?
Absolutely. You needed those sophisticated instruments in order to build the intricate triangular trade. You needed money in order to have shipping firms. You needed bookkeeping facilities. You needed investments. You needed agents. All those things that were present in the mother country, in the Netherlands, were used to stimulate trade. The trade overseas. We should never forget that the trade in the Netherlands and the trade within Europe remained more important than the trade outside of Europe. But having said that, it was important to have these institutions in place in order to facilitate the expansion out of Europe.
Again, brilliant point. I'm obviously neither of us are fond of the plantation complex, the slave trade, or imperialism, but one must be nuanced. Countries in Europe had insurance companies, estate managers, attorneys at law, and because of the higher levels of organization, Europeans were able to exploit the plantation complex. There was an Eastern European slave trade, a Swedish slave trade, and many slave trades in Africa. But Northwestern Europeans and the Portuguese and the Spain, they created business models to exploit the colonial enterprise.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think, well, I once had a student who said, well, you're always telling that the Europeans weren't the only one who traded in slaves, that the Africans traded in slaves, and that the Asians had a slave trade, even the Amerindians traded in slaves, but the Europeans were the only one who made a system out of it, who actually calculated that the slave trade should bring a profit, that you shouldn't continue with the trade if it didn't bring a profit, that you shouldn't continue with a plantation if it didn't bring a profit. And in order to measure that profit, you needed bookkeeping facilities, you needed bookkeepers, you needed sophisticated methods to calculate that. And I think that did aid the Europeans to set up the plantation complex, as you call it.
And again, we're both talking about the issue. Maybe you have seen articles explaining the topic like we're doing now, but I'm yet to find one. And there's an article titled Slavery and the Dutch Economy, 1750 to 1800. And the thesis is that as much as 40% of all the growth of the economy of Holland in the decades around 1770 can be traced back to slavery. And it's a compelling piece. I read it carefully, but the writer did not zoom in on the institutional capabilities of the Dutch. And I think that this is the broader point.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is true that the slave and plantation complex did have a boom, you could say, between 1750 and 1775. And if you look at other sectors of the Dutch economy at the time, you will find that the Dutch were stagnating. They were losing trade in Europe because of competition from the British, from the French, and from the Scandinavians. They were losing the the internal trade on the continent, because the German cities were trading themselves and didn't need Dutch ships to bring the products to them, etc., etc. So they were driven off several markets in Europe, and the trade in sugar and coffee of their own plantations then became, by definition, you could say, more important. However, that article you read on the impact of slavery on the Dutch economy is a rather devious article, because it takes as a measuring year, I think, the early 70s, 1772 or 1770, I think. And that was exactly the year when the imports of sugar and coffee into the Netherlands were larger, much larger than the years before and the years afterwards. So it isn't really very fair to take 1 year, measure then the impact of all activities connected to slavery, and then conclude it is, what is it? I think the article mentions that 5% of the Dutch GNP is generated by slave-related activities. I think that is an exaggeration. If you were to take an average for the period that slavery existed, between, let's say, 1600 and 1800, you come to a much lower percentage.
Let me read what the writer said. However, as we will show, while it was obviously of crucial importance to the existence of the Atlantic slavery system, the slave trade played only a minor role in the Dutch metropolitan economy. David Eltis, Pieter Emmer, and Frank D. Lewis have estimated that its contribution to Dutch national income was as small as 0.5%. We will show why the slave trade is neither a good indicator of the total contribution of slave-based activities to the Dutch economy, nor a reliable proxy for the change in this share over time. So I won't read all of the article. But
I do.
You may go ahead.
Yeah. Well, there is a problem. What is it? If you look, the slave trade, I think, is a good indicator for the Dutch plantation economy, because there is little indication that slaves to the Dutch plantations were transported by foreign slave traders. It was basically the Dutch who catered to their own colonies. So the volume of the Dutch slave trade is an indicator of the economic growth or decline of the Dutch plantation sector in the Dutch colonies. However, the majority of the sugar and coffee in the Netherlands, imported in the Netherlands, didn't come from the Dutch colonies. The majority probably came from the French colonies. The French colonies were expanding rapidly in the 18th century, and a large segment of their exports went either indirectly via Bordeaux or directly to the Netherlands. And then, of course, the volume of the Dutch slave trade doesn't say very much about that development. That is absolutely true.
Well, I like Brandon's work, but when people like Brandon speak about the value added component of the slave trade and the plantation complex, again, they ought to remind listeners who are not necessarily as knowledgeable as yourself about economic history that this value added component was driven by the human capital of workers in Europe. So Joseph Inekori, a distinguished scholar, he has a new paper criticizing the conservative position on slave trade. And I read it, and during my time reading it, I said to myself, well, the textile mills in Europe that were linked to the plantation complex did well because before the Industrial Revolution in Europe, there was an Industrial Revolution and the workers were innovative. If Europeans did not have quality workers, then the textile industry wouldn't exist. It would have failed.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. And of course, the weak point in all these calculations is the fact that if the slave trade had not existed, if the plantations had not existed, the Europeans would have used that capital and the products they produced for other economic activities. And you should deduct the what is it, the result of those alternatives from the results that you're actually measuring. The opportunity costs, I think, in economics are very important. And if you look at the article measuring the impact of the Dutch slave trade and slavery on the Dutch economy, you will find that the opportunity costs are not calculated. In other words, the Dutch would have been unemployed, the capital wouldn't have been invested, etc., if there hadn't been plantations, if there hadn't been a slave trade. And I think that is wrong.
Yes, and again, I said it earlier that in the absence of the plantation complex and the slave trade, Europeans would have secured other markets and other industries. It's just like being a doctor. So
Absolutely right.
you're a doctor, but if you weren't a doctor, you'd have been an attorney or an entrepreneur.
Absolutely, you're right. And I think that is something that people who do these calculations do not realize. There are alternatives, and you should actually deduct the profits from these alternatives from the profits of the slave trade and slavery, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair.
And again, we're not going to talk for a long time about the Swedish slave trade. And by the Swedish slave trade, I am talking about the slave trade that involved non-African. So Europeans
Oh, you mean
also
the
also enslaved white people, and
oh,
slavery is
yes.
always an atrocity.
Yes, that's
However,
right. I mean,
when we engage in these reckonings, we don't say, okay, the Swedes had colonies in Europe and they were enslaving whites. Well, I'm not talking about the colonies. The colonies are separate from the Swedish slave trade, but the Swedes were subjugating white people. We never say that when we talk about slavery.
no. Another group that was subjugating, that had white slaves, of course, were the North African,
The Barbary
piracy
states.
states.
Yes, the Barbary
The
states.
Barbary states, yes. They had rather large numbers of, sailors that were captured in the Mediterranean or in the Atlantic. And the whole problem is, look, we know much more about the Atlantic slave trade. We know almost to the slave how many, which year, which ship, which captain, etc., etc. We had a tremendous amount of information on the Atlantic slave trade. We have virtually no information on the inter-African slave trade, almost no information on the Arab slave trade, and very little information on slavery in the Barbary states in North Africa. Most countries in Europe, of course, try to pay ransom to the Barbary states to get their sailors home. The Dutch, by the way, the Dutch government refused to do this, but the cities where the sailors came from did try. And until today, there are still several churches in small harbors in the Netherlands where you can find a miniature ship with a hole in it. And that hole is supposed to receive the money that the churchgoers put into it in order to liberate the enslaved, fellow citizens of that city, being kept as slaves in North Africa. And again, if you look at the employment of slaves by the Barbary states, by the Arabs, let's say, you will find that it is completely different from the slavery that the Europeans practiced in the New World. The slaves had to work, let's say, in what you call that in English, in the places where stones were, where marmor was being mined. And if you look at the organization, if you look at the fact that there was not enough food, that there was no provision for sleeping, for having regular working hours, etc., you will find that, again, the Europeans made a system out of everything, and the North Africans didn't do that.
Robert C. Davis has a book on
Yes, he has a book on that.
slavery,
Yes.
and Murray Gordon has a book on slavery in the Arab world, and there's also a book on slavery in Muslim Africa, and this book is an edited collection.
Yeah, yes.
Uh,
Well, perhaps I should add that Cambridge University Press has published a series of collective essays, books on slavery, with David Altus and Sten Engerman as the main editors. And I think it's an excellent collection of essays of the best experts in the field. And if you want to know something about the slavery outside the plantation complex in the Atlantic, you're well advised to look at these publications by Cambridge University Press.
and slavery in the Muslim world. The chief editor is John Ralph Davis. I've read these
Yes,
books.
yes, I know that. Yes,
Yeah, it was the
but
debate
the
on.
whole problem is that, yeah, the
You
whole
may go
problem
ahead.
is that, yeah, well, the problem is that stories about the slavery outside the European world always look so different because there isn't the same database to build on. We have very little idea about how many slaves, were held. How big was the slave trade within Africa? How many slaves were traded by the Arabs in the east of Africa and in the Middle East? We simply don't know. The estimates say that the slave trade within Africa and the slave trade by the Arabs was somewhat smaller than the Atlantic slave trade, but not much. Again, these are estimates, and what we need, of course, is better estimates, but we will never, I think, reach the level of exactness that we have in the Atlantic slave trade. It's always a little disappointing, actually, to see studies on the slave trade outside the plantation complex.
Well, Jutta Bolt, she has a paper on the effects of indigenous slavery in Africa, and the conclusion is
Mhm.
negative. There's a negative relationship between slavery and development in Africa. And indigenous slavery, we're talking about internal slavery in Africa practiced by Africans. So Africans were enslaving other Africans.
Yeah, yeah. Um, can she prove that areas without slaves are doing much better in
Well,
Africa? I think.
actually, there's another article by a South African historian. He looked at
Mhm.
pre-contact slavery, and he said that even places in Africa that were not affected by slavery are still poor.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's very difficult to make a point that African states without slavery should economically be more viable and have more economic growth than with slavery. Um, I think if you look at the economy of Africa, it is basically a subsistence economy. And I can well understand that for some people, being a slave is more reassuring than being free, because if you're a slave, you have an owner, and your owner then is responsible to feed you, even in times when food becomes very expensive, when there is a drought, when there is hunger, etc., etc. So, in some ways, slavery is beneficial. Think of poor parents who sell their children into slavery because they want them to survive rather than die from hunger. So slavery does have a function in Africa, and the same goes for Asia, I think.
Yeah, that the historian is his name is G.J. Van Niekerk. Well, you should
Oh
know
yes,
the
Van Niekerk. Yeah, I know the
yes.
name. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes.
he sounds to be of Dutch origin, but then again he's from South
Probably yes,
Africa.
yes.
But
Mhm.
yeah, back to your point about slavery. So many of the slaves were taken to countries like Jamaica and Africa, were either slaves, slave owners, or followers of big men. Even today, many regions in Africa are still dependent on subsistence agriculture. So the
Mhm.
African mind and business mentality is not necessarily oriented for a post-industrial complex.
No,
Remember,
no, no.
Africa had long distance trades, but a trade is different from a business. Pre-colonial Africa did not have a formal banking system. Some writers like Garrett Austin and Robin Law, they have studied indigenous financial institutions in pre-colonial Africa. These institutions were not absent, but they were not formalized to the extent that Europeans or even Indians would formalize businesses. So Africans are pre-colonial Africa is really known for trade, not necessarily a business.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's important to stress the importance of institutions. And now there is another argument by Mr. Nunn. I think you've come across it.
Nathan Nunn? Okay.
Yeah, he explains that the growth of slavery in Africa, of course, was in some way sparked by the Atlantic slave trade, and that caused Africans to have no trust in their governments. And he feels that trust is a very important factor in economic development. Very undervalued argument, but it's very important. You need to trust people. If you do business, you need to give credits. You need to trust your business partners. And he made an argument that the slave trade and slavery undermined trust in Africa, and that explains the low economic growth and the fact that the Africans weren't able to develop the same way as the Europeans did.
Well, I'm familiar with that argument, and Nathan Nunn in another paper also said that without slavery, without the slave trade, Africa would have been richer, but not as rich as Western Europe. However, I must argue that Africans are not necessarily, well, James Robinson, he has a different view, but based on what I've read, tribalism in Africa is more fundamental than the slave trade. There are books on the role of the stranger in African society. So the slave trade compounded the issue of low trust in Africa, but Africa always had problems with diversity and trusting people.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's the argument is exaggerated. There's something to it. First of all, it's very difficult to falsify it because all of Africa has slave trade. So you should then say that there is more trust in African societies with less slaves, and less trust in African society with more slaves. I think it's very difficult to make those statements. So there is something uneasy about the argument, but you're absolutely right. There are more important factors, I think, to explain the, let's say, the normal economic growth of Africa, the exceptional growth that Europe experienced starting in the middle of the 18th century. I think you need a lot of conditions to be fulfilled before you could reach that stage. And Africa and parts of Asia haven't fulfilled those conditions.
Yeah, it's just like what Joel Moker said about the epistemic base. So medieval Europe did not have an epistemic base. Industrial Europe had an epistemic base, and this was supported by the scientific revolution and Enlightenment ideals. And again, look at Japan. Japan developed know-how, but why was the diffusion of know-how so successful in Japan? There's actually a paper on the relationship between long-term orientation. Hold on, let me make a good point. There's actually a paper on the relationship.
I need to go to answer the doorbell. I'm sorry. I'll be back in.
All right, not a problem.
Sorry. Okay.
All right. So you're
Sorry
back.
about that.
Yes, it's a part of the new world. So back to Japan. When Japan acquired the know-how to industrialize, Japan also had a complementary culture, long-term
Mhm.
orientation, and patience. So we can never ignore the role of culture in explaining economic fortunes. Know-how is important, but countries on the eve of acquiring know-how need the right culture. So as we said earlier, Europeans already had a culture that was oriented for business. So when they acquired intellectual know-how, it was easier for them to revolutionize society.
Absolutely true. I think uh, I could have improved on that. It's a perfect definition of why economic growth took place in certain places and not in other places. It's absolutely true. The problem is, of course, that culture is, yeah, it's more difficult to measure than, let's say, figures. So, but you're absolutely right. Without the appropriate culture, economic growth is virtually impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible. You have to look. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Just like this
Yeah.
show. Sometimes people will forget. So I should remind them. If I don't remind them and they forget, that's my fault, not their fault. If
Yeah.
you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Absolutely. And of course, if you have a factory or a business and you employ the number of people that are just necessary to keep it going and to make a profit, if you then suddenly start involving family members who need a job or what is it, family from family, well, then you ruin your business. And of course, in many countries, without the business culture that is so vital, this would happen.
Yeah, I actually wrote an article on the role of kinship networks in Africa and how they impede business
Mhm.
formation. Yeah, that's an actual problem in the developing world.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to say that already in the 17th century, the Dutch captains from ships who traded with Africa noticed it. They said, well, the merchants that we do business with in Africa are just as clever as we are, and they can calculate, they can do sums, the same as we. The problem is, as soon as they've made a profit, they need to bury it because if they show it, there is a family member who wants to share, another family wants to. Within, let's say, a day, their profits are gone, and they can't reinvest it. So that's the problem of Africa. It's indeed the kinship structure and the solidarity among the Africans that made it difficult to get private capital to grow and to have capital available for investment.
Yeah, in economics, it is actually called a solidarity tax. People have actually studied the
Mhm.
topic. So it's a real problem. But this is my last point. Recently, William and Kate visited Jamaica. They did a Caribbean tour. So people
Mhm.
who follow economic history know that corruption is an impediment to growth in Jamaica. There's also the perplexing problem of garrison politics. So politicians actually enabled garrison or what I would call gangster-like communities. The evidence on it is quite clear. So students of
Mhm.
economic history are familiar with Jamaica's lack of growth over the years. William and Kate went to Jamaica. Some people say to shore up the significance of the monarchy. People protested against William and Kate. The PM bluntly told them that Jamaica will become a republic. And as an observer, I was actually laughing because I'm saying the evidence is clear. We know Jamaica is not in a rut because of the British. We can't blame the British for its economic underperformance. We know what the World Bank have been saying. So these people, one, they were basically making non-silly billies look like a laughing stock. And two, the approach to the situation was quite tacky. William and Kate went to Jamaica for a visit, and
Mhm.
you don't ensure that your guests feel uncomfortable. You make them feel comfortable. If you want to talk
Yeah.
about reparations or becoming a republic, use diplomatic channels. So the entire fiasco was quite tacky.
Mhm.
Yes.
No, I don't want to comment
Yeah,
because
you don't. You shouldn't.
I
You shouldn't. You should not comment. You shouldn't. No, I'm just sharing that there with you. You should not comment because you're a white academic. So that would be very. You should. Yeah, you'd be a madman to comment. You shouldn't comment. But yes, it's quite tacky. If you
No,
don't,
absolutely, you're right. No, you're absolutely right. I think what is it recently? What is it? Not only me, but several of my colleagues have been accused of racism if the arguments didn't fit the popular vision of history. So it is a discussion that is riddled with what is it, pitfalls and difficulties. On the other hand, I think slowly but gradually we're seeing through the mist of false arguments what is important in economic development, what made countries rich, which made countries poor. We'll slowly arrive, I think, at a common sense understanding.
yeah, like even the opposition leader wanted to talk to the royals, but look, if Jamaicans want to have a conversation with the British, there's an ambassador. You can talk
Yeah,
to that ambassador to source opportunities for trade and technology. That's how countries get rich, when they acquire know-how, not
yeah,
when
no,
they
no, no, no,
dwell
no,
on
no, no.
irrelevant
I
issues.
think you, I think you call him High Commissioner in Jamaica.
Yes, I
No, you're
commissioner.
absolutely right. The impact of the colonizer, what is it, is usually overestimated. Uh, Colonialism, what did it mean in the 17th and 18th century? A very had a impact on society because the means weren't there and the technology wasn't there, etc., etc. So to blame the colonizer for everything that went wrong afterwards, I think, is a little too easy.
What did you say? A very what society? You were talking about
Well,
colonialism, and you said a very what society. So I didn't hear that part.
well, I, I think the colonial society and the impact of colonialism on that society, I think, is usually overestimated.
Yes.
And I think we don't realize that in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and even the earlier 20th centuries, the means to exert influence were really minimal, and that on society was only in a small corner. Anyway, what is it? It's been nice talking to you,
Yes, yes. And
and I wonder. I know this is being recorded. Are you editing this conversation together with other conversations? Are you
no, no,
publishing it or
it's just
making
an
it available?
yeah, I'll send you a copy.
Oh, that is very
Yeah,
nice. That
yeah,
would be
I'll
very
send
nice.
you a copy. But yeah, speaking to you has been a pleasure. And before you go, remember, Murray last said that Nigerians should be proud of the Sokoto Caliphate. So apparently, only white emperors should have a history of shame. But bye.
That's absolutely,
Yeah, we
it's
could continue
absolutely true.
forever, but you have to go. So bye. But we could continue forever.
Okay, well, it's been nice talking to you, and I look forward to what is it, to your email with the what is it,
But the
with the
video.
tape, is it?
All right.
With the video. That's it. Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.